Do you believe there's spies in our country?
Oh yeah, of course.
Absolutely. Okay. And say, what is the process for that? If you identify someone you believe might be a spy, is there a process that for sure for that one?
I don't exactly think there is. I actually got information on a double agent late last year. Luckily they're not in the United States, and so I was like, I'll pass it to the CIA, right? That makes sense. And I've never even got a response on it. And that's a double agent. So yeah, if there is, I mean, I'm assuming it's a counterintelligence department at FBI is who I'd assume you pass it to. Now, how you get it to them and have to send it to some random tip line and hope the person working the tip line understands the nuance of it or the importance of it. I just don't know. I mean, I have a big problem, as you can imagine, with like the rewards for justice. That's where people are supposed to go for terrorism type of stuff. And I send foreigners there all the time. They end up interacting with someone who has no idea what they're talking about, as you can imagine. They say weird things like, send me everything you know. I had a guy, he's been working terrorists 40 years. He said, Sarah, this chick told me to send her everything I know. He's like, I have like full hard drives of terrorist information. Like, what is she talking about? And he finally just ended the conversation. He's like, this person's incompetent. Like, think about it. Those are who foreigners even have to interact with to pass off information. I've interacted with Rewards for Justice and actually ended up blocking them that they're so incompetent. So yeah, so it's very frustrating. There is not proper systems to pass off any sort of threat information in the United States. You just have to get lucky and have like one champion who's competent to do it for you, sadly.
I had no idea that was the answer because that's disheartening to know that there really is no real path currently that is showing any kind of effect. The Mexican border, obviously, they have a new president, and I'm not
Mm-hmm.
sure. How do you feel about the new president? Do you know anything about that?
I mean, I don't know anything about her to make an opinion, unfortunately.
Yeah, the the Mexican side of our border is a intimidating one because it feels like there is no real order to the control of the cartel or any kind of criminal organization. It feels like they kind of they're free to do as they please, and that becomes a concern. The last person I interviewed said that the cartel was mentioning to him as a journalist. He's a journalist that is close with the cartel and reports on them. They're excited to hear if Trump wins because that would mean that it's harder to get across, which means the prices for
Mm-hmm.
crossing go up, which is the kind of thing that like I never expected to hear in that conversation, which, you know, this is the concern I have. It's like I feel like, with people like you with your experience and the people like him with their experience, I'm not seeing answers that put America in a place where I can feel safe. And that's
Yeah,
scary.
I mean, I think one of the issues we get our head wrapped around it with, right, is hey, these cartels are so powerful, right? They control Mexico and we can't do anything about it. I think the thing we can do something about and we don't is basically when they cross our border, right? I mean, there's U.S. companies, U.S. persons assisting them, in the trafficking of whatever it is, or involved in any sort of crime they're involved in. Like we do have power to affect the people in the United States, right? Like we really need to be going after the enablers of these cartels in the United States, and making the business difficult for them. And I really don't think we do things like that. I think we view the cartel issue as outside or in Mexico, and we don't view the networks the way we should and target them the way we should in the United States. And it's for multiple reasons. One, they're in the United States, right? They're now basically a US citizen status. It makes it more difficult. And sometimes when something's more difficult, people aren't going to go, die in that hill for it, right? They're like, we're going to stick to the low hanging fruit. I'm not putting my neck out or my career out to go after this, whatever, this gang network in Maryland, right? Like it's not going to benefit my career, for example. And it's a huge broken system we have going. And I think maybe we should rethink how we classify U.S. citizen status to allow more operations to occur in the United States.
Yeah. One of my guests talked about how, he believes there's cartel inundated throughout,
Mm-hmm.
America, for some reason when there is, a killing that is connected to drugs and cartel, it's not talked about as publicly for some reason. Right. And that's just a crazy concept. Um, Jason Jones, we interviewed him and he's just fascinating. He's here in Texas and he's doing all the work he can to kind of exploit that. For those who, when I talk about 9/11, I've talked about it several times publicly, and people come back and say, yeah, but those people were all here on a visa. They were here legally. And so then the threat that they pose the conversation that the threat of a terrorist attack because of the illegal immigration is, again, fear mongering, because anytime there's been a terrorist attack in here, it's been a citizen, American citizen, or someone who's here legally. I would love to hear your opinion on that.
Yeah, well, actually, they were here legally because Al Qaeda determined at the time that U.S. student visas were the easiest visa to get. And that's why they chose to get them student visas. Now, Al Qaeda has decided, hey, it's easiest just to go over the U.S. southern border. And so they're sending terrorists to Iran, to Turkey, and then they're flying to places like Brazil and whatnot and coming up. So the terrorists at different times will make different decisions. So yeah, the student visa was easiest then. That's why they targeted it. Taliban has even made a slightly different focus. They've said, hey, since all these countries, not just US, are so willing to bring in Afghans, let's actually hunt down who actually at some time is a Taliban and served with the US government or the British government or the German government and can go through a legal refugee process, into those countries and then operate on our behalf. So they still are looking at the legal visa processes and seeing how they can do it. Another thing too is what a lot of people don't realize, this war has been going on for 20 years. Like Al Qaeda, for example, has visa officers at embassies, right? In Turkey, an Al Qaeda leader was running like the Libyan and the embassy in Malaysia and issuing visas for years to terrorists, right? In Afghanistan, you can go there from any country and get an Afghan passport, right? You can be Iraqi, Egyptian, Syrian, it doesn't matter. So a lot of people need to realize too, there are now terrorists within these legitimate networks, and they're still trying to get legitimate visas, as you can imagine, because it puts them in a better position wherever they go.
Yeah, that's like loopholes that people are not seeing. There's tons of loopholes. Almost any country could come here currently and claim political asylum, and they get the opportunity to stay here until their claim is met by an immigration judge, right? And in that time, if they have a baby here, now they have another argument to sway. It's an interesting conversation.
Yeah, and I actually get that argument a lot. I get, hey, Afghans haven't been involved in these terrorist attacks in the United States over the years, so they're not a threat. It's like, no, their passport used to be super weak. It was very, very difficult for an Afghan to get a visa and come to the United States, right? Now it's so easy. They get a tourist or humanitarian visa somewhere in Latin America and they come straight up, right? So the threat landscape has changed because the freedom of movement for some of these people, right? Be it the Indians, Syrians, Chinese, gosh, there's so many Africans seeding their way into the pipelines in the United States, right? This freedom of movement has changed that calculus.
And you say the Africans, is that a threat in your opinion?
Yeah, well, the thing is with the Afghans, right? There's the good guys we want to bring in, and then unfortunately a lot of the bad guys got in. So I think they're a threat to our country, and then they're of course a threat to our allies. As I've brought up some of the examples as to why. Yeah. And remember, a lot of these Afghans are well trained too. So that's another thing you got to keep in mind. We should be most concerned about persons coming from the locations where they actually have had quality training, right? Because they are going to be the biggest threat here in the United States. And I think that's why even people worry about things like the Chinese, right? Like, hey, have these men been through military training, right? That is important. That's an important piece of the calculus.
Yeah, and then you mentioned Africa. There's been several operations from special operations out in Africa trying to dismantle some of the ISIS training camps that are out there as well. And so that makes Africa part of the concern as well, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, and in Africa, there's been wars going on for years. I mean, children go to training camps in Africa, right? I mean, and they're highly trained there too. And remember, in the United States, there aren't that many people trained. I know that sounds really bad, right? But we have a very small percentage of our country who served in the military. We have a very small percentage of our country compared to some of these places. Like some countries, it's a forced mandatory military training, right? So, we need to keep that in mind too. Don't just, look at a book and be like, oh, you know, he looks fine when he could have been in special operations. There was actually a very senior ISIS leader. He had been the head of special operations for his government's military in Tajikistan, right? He ended up joining ISIS and was one of the best commanders, right? A number of our Benghazi attackers had spent time, in their military before joining a terrorist group. And we see that all the time, in the Pakistan region as well. Like even people serve their entire career and then they don't really know what to do after and they join a terrorist group. So it's very dangerous.
Absolutely.